Cory Doctorow is a multi-award-winning science fiction novelist, blogger, and technology activist. His latest book, Attack Surface, part of your digital gift bag, by the way, is a standalone adult sequel to the best-selling novel Little Brother. He's the co-editor of the popular blog Boing Boing and contributes to many magazines, websites, and newspapers. He also works as a special consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Join Cory now as he explores privacy, interoperability, and the rewilding of the internet.
Yay! We did it. We have the technology. Can you tell that my doctorate in computer science is strictly honorary? All right. Tom Eastman, 2018. He tweeted this thing. He said, I am old enough to remember when the web wasn't just 4 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 3. And that really struck a nerve for me. And it made me start to ask how it was that our digital technology had become so monopolized, how we'd gone from this world where it felt like you could make some code, you could make it available, it could go to other people's devices, they could run that code, you could start a site and you could find an audience, where things were really decentralized, they were wild. How did we get to this place where they were so locked down? Now, there's a traditional story about this, which is that the monopoly was inevitable, that we just got monopolies because tech has these natural monopolies. It has network effects and first mover advantages. But the more you look into the monopoly picture, the more it becomes clear that this is not a tech problem. This is an everything problem. We have monopolies in virtually every sector in our world, or oligopolies. It's not just ad tech that has 2 companies, it's beer and spirits. It's not just social media dominated by one company. It's also professional wrestling and eyeglasses. No one is going to say that professional wrestling became a single company town because of network effects and first mover advantages. It's because we changed the way that we enforce anti-monopoly law. So I need to give you just a brief history lesson here to get the discussion framed up. Before 1980, the way that anti-monopoly law was enforced through most of what we call the West was that firms were considered bad if they were monopolies because we thought monopolies were bad. That monopolies distorted our public policy and they made life qualitatively worse for the people who labored under them and the people whose industries were dominated by them. And in the 1980s or the late 1970s, there was a revolution in the way that we thought about anti-monopoly. A guy named Robert Bork became a kind of court sorcerer to Ronald Reagan. And he proposed a new model of anti-monopoly enforcement. It was called the consumer welfare model. He said that rather than enforcing against monopolies because they're monopolies, we should only enforce against monopolies if we can show that they're harming consumer welfare. And the way that you did that was by proving that they were raising prices. And the way that you did that was by building an economic model that only Robert Bork and his friends at the University of Chicago knew how to build. And so what that meant was that every time there were firms that were contemplating merging with one another in order to create a monopolistic situation, Robert Bork or one of his friends would make a model and pronounce that there would be no consumer welfare harms as a result of that merger. And then if after the merger prices went up, you could go back to those University of Chicago economists and you can say, did the prices go up because of the monopoly? And they would say, no, we have once again consulted the model and we can say that the prices went up for reasons unrelated to monopoly. It's because of price shocks from labor or oil or energy or some other exogenous factor. The monopoly itself was never at fault. It was as though we went from a world in which everybody had a say in how monopolies should be regulated because what we cared about was the qualitative lived experience of being in a monopoly. And we switched it to this quantitative experience that could only be addressed by a small priesthood. These models became like the ritual oxes that were slaughtered by a court priest to tell you whether or not the king was right. So the king would pronounce an edict and the priest would drag in the ox and cut it open and read its guts and would tell you that the guts of the ox told us that the king was right and that everything was fine and that any problems you had were strictly your own. So monopoly is bad per se. I think that that's the conclusion that we need to come to after 40 years of living under monopolies. And the reason monopolies are bad is because when an industry dwindles down to 3 or 4 companies or even 5 or 6, they not only can extract excess rents, they make more money by squeezing their suppliers and charging their customers more, but they can also mobilize those rents, right? When an industry is down to just a few companies, the executives who run those companies find it pretty easy to come to a common bargaining position and to put that bargaining position to lawmakers and to get policy that is favorable to their industry, even if it comes at the public expense. And for that reason, I think monopoly should always be resisted. So one of the things that falls out of living in a world in which all of our public policy is being distorted by monopoly is that conspiracies become a lot more plausible. Another word for conspiracy, after all, is corruption. When people say that they don't trust vaccines, they're not saying they don't trust science. They're saying that they don't trust the companies that told us that opioids were safe, and they don't trust the regulators that the companies bought off who affirmed that opioids were safe until there were hundreds of thousands of dead bodies and only then took action. And that action did not come with meaningful punishment for the companies whose owners are still billionaires richer than the Rockefellers. I do believe in vaccines, but I think that the idea that vaccine hesitancy just comes out of the air like pollen, or is the result of mind control rays wielded by big tech platforms, as opposed to a not entirely unreasonable conclusion to come to after you have been traumatized by a corrupt, concentrated industry whose watchdogs were revealed to be toothless. I think that is a completely understandable impulse. And moreover, I think that what big tech does here is it allows people who've experienced those traumas and who are wondering whether they should trust the science, or at least the institution that surrounds the science. It lets them find each other, egg each other on, give each other support, all those things that we love about the internet, all those things that made the internet the thing that we wanted to use back in the old days. So what are we going to do about monopolies? Well, we can unwind mergers. That's a pretty good idea. Most of these companies that have risen to monopoly status did not do so by making the best product. They did so by buying the companies that made the best product. The thing that predicts whether you'll win in today's market is not whether you're making something people love. It's whether the capital markets will allocate enough cheap credit to you or capital to you that you can buy the companies that make the products that you love. After all, Google is a company that's only made 1.5 products in its entire history that people liked. They made a search engine and they made a pretty good Hotmail clone. Everything else Google has done that succeeded was a company they bought from someone else, from their ad tech stack to their mobile platform to YouTube. And everything that they made in-house, up to and including the Wi-Fi balloons, have crashed and burned. No one uses them. They've shut them down themselves. And so we can unwind these mergers, and that would go a long way to demonopolizing our internet. And it would also go a long way to demonopolizing other firms. You know, we did not get 2 beer companies, 2 spirits companies, 1 wrestling league, and 1 eyeglass company because one company just made the best products. We got it because they bought all of their competitors. And so we can force them to separate too. But tech is not like other industries. Tech has its own distinctive characteristics that allow us to make other moves that aren't as slow and ponderous as company breakups, moves that are faster and more expedient. Tech is intrinsically flexible. All computers are capable of running all programs. They are Turing complete von Neumann machines. And that means that if you have one technology that dominates, you can make another technology that plugs into it and siphons off its users or its revenue models, or allows the users who are stuck inside a walled garden to exercise more autonomy. When the Australian system resulted in every state having its own rail gauge, they spent 150 years trying to make rail cars that could drop one set of wheels and retract another so that a single rail car could traverse the whole country. And after more than 200 tries, they just gave up. And now they're tearing up thousands of kilometers of rail and laying new ones. But if you have a Microsoft Word file and you want to read it on your Mac, you just get a copy of iWork Suite. Steve Jobs didn't have to beg Bill Gates to make a version of Word that would run on the Mac that was good. The version that Bill Gates was offering was quite terrible when iWork Suite came about. He just had some reverse engineers make a compatibility layer that allowed them to read and write those Microsoft Word files. That's the difference. And that poses real significant remedies that we can use to demonopolize our technical world. Monopoly is a problem not just because it affects our policy and our lives when we deal with tech. It's a problem because it drives all of the ancillary industries, all the industries that talk to tech, to engage in surveillance, to engage in privacy invasive conduct. So if you want to have a successful newspaper, you need Google Analytics and you need Facebook like buttons and you need all kinds of trackers and other privacy invading technology. How many times have you read a newspaper article decrying surveillance on a website that placed 50 trackers on you while you read that page? So the platforms have argued that they are very good at managing our privacy, but they have been rocked by scandal after scandal as they mismanaged that privacy, as they lied to us, as the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And the response to each of those scandals was not to open up the platforms and allow for competition and allow us to maybe choose to use platforms that were more privacy respecting. It was to lock those platforms down in the name of defending our privacy. After the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook closed down the APIs that made it possible for people to compete with Facebook around the edges. And so now Facebook has become even more of a walled garden in the name of protecting ourselves. The platforms are not good guardians of our privacy, even when they claim to be. They do guard our privacy when it serves their interests, but our interests and theirs are not the same. So think about Facebook. Facebook is a company that claims that it's defending our privacy, and for that reason, they limit who can scrape the website, because if you can scrape Facebook, you might end up invading our privacy. But they use that as an excuse to evade scrutiny and also oversight. So after the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the various election scandals, Facebook promised to crack down on paid disinformation. And they created a bunch of rules about what political ads could and could not say and how they had to be labeled. Well, they didn't enforce those rules very well. And to prove it, a group of academics at New York University's School of Engineering built a pair of products, or a pair of services. One is called Ad Observer and the other is called Ad Observatory. Ad Observer is a browser plugin that takes a snapshot of every ad that you're served while you use Facebook. And Ad Observatory is a repository where all of those scraped ads are placed so that accountability journalists, security researchers, political disinformation specialists, and regulators can discover whether or not Facebook is living up to its promises. It won't surprise you to hear that Facebook is not living up to its promises, and it might not surprise you to learn that Facebook has threatened legal action against this Ad Observer project for violating its terms of service. And they say that they have to do this because that is how that they will protect Facebook users' privacy, is by blocking people from scraping Facebook. Even though the Ad Observer plugin is free and open source software, and you can see that there is no privacy question that arises from its use, Facebook is able to hide behind privacy. And it's not just Facebook. You have companies like Apple that say we don't sell your data and therefore we are a good custodian of your privacy. And that's true. Apple won't sell your data in order to better advertise to you. What Apple will do, however, is cooperate with the Chinese government to block working cryptography tools, the privacy tools that Chinese users use to hide themselves from state secrecy. And they did this at a moment in which we were learning that 1 million people of Turkic Muslim descent, primarily Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, have been put in concentration camps where they'd been subject to forced labor, punitive rape, non-consensual medical experimentation, and so on. It is not much of a relief to learn that the reason that Apple collaborated with your privacy invasion was not to advertise to you, but rather to help the Chinese government figure out whether or not you belonged in a concentration camp. And Google also makes a lot of claims about protecting our privacy. They're eliminating third-party cookies and doing all kinds of things that are arguably very good for privacy, but only when it serves their interests. Because Google also collects and retains your location data, and then they give it to the police when the police show up with reverse warrants, wanting to know everyone who is at a demonstration, for example. Google will cough up their location data. The thing about privacy is that when it comes to interoperability, over-collection presents a kind of perverse incentive, because the more data a company collects on us, the harder it is to argue that interoperability might be safe. If a company has a lot of data on you and you allow third parties to connect to that company's products and services, well then all of that data might leak to those third-party products and services. So the more a company collects, the worse it behaves, the more it can argue that government shouldn't allow competitors to muscle in on its patch. And so this produces the worst of all outcomes. Monopolists who are bad for our privacy, and the worse they are for our privacy, the better they are at being monopolists. So what industry specific remedies does technology have? What can we do that will help us restore competition to technology without compromising our privacy? And I think the big one has to be interoperability. I think that interoperability creates the possibility of a web in which we restore the kinds of maneuvers that were once a commonplace in technology, where when Zuckerberg started Facebook, he didn't need to address the fact that everybody who wanted to use social media was already on MySpace and all their friends were there too, and try and convince people that they should all leave MySpace en masse and go to Facebook, or that they should decamp from MySpace one at a time and wait on Facebook for their friends to show up there. Instead, he was able to make an interoperable tool, a little bot that you could give your MySpace login and password to, and it would go to MySpace, get your waiting messages, put them in your Facebook inbox, and when you replied to them, it would pilot them back out to your MySpace inbox or to your friends' MySpace inboxes. And in that way, you could kind of trickle out of Facebook instead of having to flood out of Facebook, solving the collective action problem and allowing for an upstart company with not very many users to break the monopoly enjoyed by Rupert Murdoch's MySpace, one of the most rapacious monopolists in the history of the world. So how do we do interoperability with tech? Well, there's a lot of proposals right now for mandates where tech would be forced to open up some or all of its interfaces to allow third parties to connect to it. In the US, there was the 2020 Access Act, which proposes that the largest firms in tech would be required to allow third parties to connect to their services. So Facebook would have to allow you to send and receive messages to people who weren't on Facebook, and people who weren't on Facebook could send and receive messages to Facebook. In the European Union, we have the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act that proposes some fairly similar things. And in the UK, the Competition and Market Authority report has some recommendations for interoperability mandates as well. So these interoperability mandates take three forms. The first one is something that's already very familiar to anyone who's lived under the GDPR. It's data portability. A data portability mandate requires a company on request to hand you all of your data in a machine readable format. That's pretty useful if you're like using a cloud drive to distribute files, or if you've got a team workspace where you and your colleagues all want to leave and go somewhere else, you can get all your data and go somewhere else. And that does enhance competition. But it's not very good for increasing competition with social media services and interactive services. You don't want to just take your address book somewhere else. You want to be able to continue to talk to the people who are in that address book when you get there. The next form of interoperability that's proposed under these mandates is what's called back-end interoperability. So this is most broadly seen in the Access Act in the US, but the CMA also addresses it. And it's the idea that these big companies, because they are chimeras, because they're Frankenstein's monsters that have merged a whole bunch of other companies to make one big one, they already have some way for all of those different divisions to talk to each other. You know, Facebook has an API that WhatsApp and MySpace, or WhatsApp and Instagram use, so that Facebook users and Instagram users and MySpace and WhatsApp users' data can all be merged and sorted and processed, and messages can traverse the systems and so on. So what the Access Act contemplates is just forcing Facebook and companies like it to expose those APIs. They say, well, there's no reason that API would be anything but the best API Facebook knows how to make, because the better that API is, the better Facebook's internal services work. So if we force them to expose that to competitors, then we'll be able to get good interoperability from them. Now, obviously, there are some problems with this. What if that competitor that they're forcing them to expose the API to is Cambridge Analytica, or some scam artist who's doing identity theft, or some other bad actor? The way that this is addressed in all of the proposed regulations is with a fiduciary, a third party who has some regulatory basis for their existence, whose conduct is limited by regulation, by statute, and who sits in judgment. You make an application to them to access Facebook's APIs, and they, not Facebook, make a decision about whether you are a good actor and a legitimate competitor, and decide whether or not you can access the API. The other form of interoperability, besides back-end interoperability and data portability, is what's called delegatability. That's what Zuckerberg did to connect to MySpace. That's when you allow for user interfaces to be automated by third parties. So say you could have a browser plugin that every time you logged into Facebook would check to see whether or not the privacy dashboard had changed. And if it had, would update the privacy dashboard so that you are as private as possible. Or it might go in periodically and empty out your inbox and put it in an inbox in a rival service, or do some other kind of interoperable component that allows you to use one service to access another. And so those front-end interoperability as opposed to back-end interoperability also has some problems. It makes user interfaces a little brittle, but it doesn't have the same risk that back-end interoperability does, because you can only access data that a user is allowed to see. So you give your login and password for Facebook to a bot. Facebook only shows that bot the things that you're allowed to see. And so there isn't the same risk that Facebook will expose other people to bad actors, because if they've already decided you're allowed to see it, well, then you're allowed to see it. And if you're a bad actor, well, nothing has changed. You're still a bad actor. You were a bad actor before the automated tool, and you're a bad actor now. But there's a problem with all of these mandates, as promising as they seem, and that's that these companies cheat and lie like crazy. One of the ways that we have come to the point where we're no longer happy with these companies is we know that whenever they're regulated or when they make a promise to do better, that they find ways to subvert it. That's a pretty common story in technology regulation, that tech companies can move fast, regulation moves slow. And so there's this question, how do we make an interoperability mandate that isn't immediately subverted? How do we stop Facebook, for example, from taking those APIs that are today as useful as possible because they connect Facebook to Instagram to WhatsApp, and nerf them down, weaken them so that they don't do any useful work? And as a result, they can still expose them to third parties, but the third parties don't get anything good out of them. For that to work, we need another kind of interoperability, not a mandated interoperability, but an adversarial interoperability. Adversarial interoperability is a very old concept in technology. You know, we have a lot of interoperable services that work together because they were planned that way. You know, people go to a standards body and define a standard like HTTP that allows web sessions to open and close, or DVB that allows digital television signals to be transmitted, received, and decoded. But there's also a kind of interoperability that is nearly as old, that exists not because manufacturers cooperate to make their products work together, but instead because they fight each other to stop their products from working together. And yet the new company comes in and finds a way for their product to talk to the old company's products and services. So an example of that you're probably familiar with right now in your own home or under your desk is third-party ink cartridges. HP and Epson and the other big printer manufacturers would like very dearly for you to pay more than vintage Veuve Clicquot for your printer ink. They have all kinds of technical countermeasures to stop you from refilling your printer, from using a third-party cartridge. And yet there are manufacturers who figure out how to circumvent or subvert those locks and make third-party printer ink that allows your printer to talk to any ink, not just the ink that the manufacturer wants. You don't have to arrange your affairs to benefit the shareholders. And there are other examples of that from the history of technology. The IBM PC clone is a very big example of that, but so is cable television. Cable television came into existence when people in small towns in Pennsylvania decided that the best way they could sell televisions was by putting up a giant aerial that could receive the big city signals coming from many, many kilometers away, and then run wires into their customers' houses that would redistribute those signals to them. This was done over the protests of the broadcasters, and it was done in spite of those protests, and it became an industry that is now not only as powerful as broadcasters, but effectively has merged with broadcasters. Most cable operators are broadcasters. Most broadcasters are also involved in cable services. It's also true of the iWork suite. It's also true of the modem, which was plugged into phone lines despite the objections of phone companies. It's true up and down the tech stack. It's true when Google presented itself to web servers as a user and said, can I look at all of your web pages, please? And then made an index of them. Over and over again, we see this interoperability without cooperation. But even though all of the tech giants owe their existence to adversarial interoperability, each of these tech giants has taken enormous measures to make sure that nobody can ever do adversarial interoperability to them. Once they've gone up the ladder, they did everything they could to kick it away. So, for example, Facebook, that came into existence by scraping a rival network so that its users didn't have to choose between their friends and Facebook's service, they went after other services that did the very same thing. For example, Power Ventures, that made a unified dashboard that you could read all your social media inboxes on, because it would go off and scrape them for you. I see that I'm getting a note here. Thank you, Aaron. All of these companies have since gone after these rivals and used copyright law and cybersecurity law, software patents, non-disclosure, non-compete laws to shut down adversarial interoperability, to make sure that nobody else can do them. So we need to restore adversarial interoperability. We need to make it a possibility, because adversarial interoperability is fast. If Facebook breaks the interface that its competitors are using to talk to Facebook, then those same competitors can just make their own interfaces by making scrapers and bots and other kinds of technology that go to Facebook, get the same data, maybe not as reliably, and puts it into their inboxes. Now, Facebook can get mired in a long technical war with these competitors, and they surely will. But those technical wars are wars that Facebook is going to struggle to win. Because if you've got 2.6 billion users, figuring out who's a bot and who's just someone who's really, really weird, if you think about it, 2.6 billion users includes 2,600 one in a million use cases every single day. That's a really hard challenge. So there are a lot of behaviors that bots can engage in that will be indistinguishable from a large tranche of Facebook's users. So this changes the calculus for Facebook. It doesn't, it goes from, well, if we break this interface, our competitors go away, to if we break this interface, we get mired in an endless grinding arms race with people who make bots and scrapers and reverse engineer and try to find other ways to talk to our service. We go from having a managed solution that we can at least plan for to a constant 3-alarm fire that we're always fighting to do something about. So there are risks to this. Companies whose interests coincide with their users, if they lose the legal right to block adversarial interoperability, they will also lose the ability to protect their users by suing their competitors. But those companies are not particularly good custodians of those users. They have sold them out over and over again. And if they are going to protect those users, they should protect them using privacy law, not copyright law, not patent law, not cybersecurity law. If we are going to defend users, the people who decide what is and isn't acceptable shouldn't be companies. It should be democratically elected legislatures. And so that's why European privacy law represents such an enormous step forward. There are problems with the GDPR, to be sure, but the idea that we have a distinct standard for what is and isn't acceptable in respect to private information that isn't just arrived at by fiat or self-serving logic from large firms, that's really important. It makes all the difference in the world. And what it does is it creates a set of remedies for instances in which interoperators do bad things with privacy, where you plug into Facebook to steal user data, steal their identities, fuel them with disinformation, trick them into fraudulent offers or what have you. The privacy law can be brought to bear on those people. And the thing that we can be sure of if those people are convicted is that they were doing something that was bad for privacy and not just something that was bad for Facebook's shareholders. Privacy is too important to entrust to unilateral corporate decisions. So interoperability will undo the perverse incentive to over-collect in order to maintain your monopoly. An interoperable platform is incentivized to practice minimization and consent, right? That's the outcome when you have an interoperable platform, because you have to worry about your users going somewhere else, and you have to worry about complying with privacy law. So you put all that together and you get a system that allows us to not only free ourselves from the iron grip of these tech platforms, to stop being the mutual hostage takers of our friends who stay on the platforms because we're there, and then we stay on the platforms because they're there, and instead to come up with a world where we do have diverse ways to find communities and find rules that make sense for our own privacy implications, our own privacy contours. And where choosing those communities, choosing those platforms doesn't mean leaving all your friends behind. And where democracy and not corporate fiat decides what is and isn't acceptable behavior in respect of your private data. Now, this is all based on a paper that I co-wrote with my Electronic Frontier Foundation colleague, Bennett Cyphers. And yes, we do have a technologist whose surname is Cyphers. He was born with that name, although if he'd taken that name, you could forgive him because it's such a good one. And that paper is called Privacy Without Monopoly. You can just search for that on your favorite search engine. It will also be on the slide at the end of my talk. And I do have a few minutes here for questions. So I wanted to take one from Sarah Clark. Sarah says, data as commodity or property doesn't work. Do you think we can make a concept of employment work for our personal data? Employment of part or whole of identities invisible from us, envisioned as different varieties of inherently linked independent symbiotes versus separate beings. That is a somewhat abstract question, but I think Sarah's point is really important, which is that property frameworks don't work at all for data for some reasons that should be relatively obvious. Do you own the fact that your boss sexually harassed you, or does he? And if you both own the fact in common, then does he get a veto over whether or not you can disclose that fact? Factual matters are just not well suited to property frameworks. Property works best where you have clear title and exclusive rights. But that is not to say that privacy is invaluable, and we do have ways of managing valuable things that aren't property. In fact, the most valuable things in our world, human beings, are not treated as property and actually have an entire body of law that relates to them that is distinct from property law. When you stab someone, it's not theft of blood. You haven't committed a tort. You've committed assault. We have a vocabulary. We have a legal framework. The thing about that legal framework is it acknowledges that there are overlapping claims to people, just as there are overlapping claims to private data. So my wife and I have a daughter. She has a claim over herself. We each have a claim over her. We have a claim together over her. Her grandparents have a claim over her, as do her friends, as does the school, and as does the Child Protective Services in the city we live in. All of those claims overlap, and we have a body of law that acknowledges that human beings aren't like property and that these overlapping claims need to be adjudicated in different ways at different parts of the person's life. And that is a very abstract answer to how we should manage privacy. But I think that it does get to the core piece here, which is that privacy law needs to stop making recourse to property law and instead re-envision something that is sui generis, unique unto itself, that treats with the distinctive characteristics of private information that are in no way like property, even though it is very, very valuable. David Waring asks, what can be done with IP laws to loosen the iron grip? So one of the things that we've seen with IP laws and other kinds of laws like cybersecurity and non-compete and so on is that very large firms who dominate their sector and don't have to fear competition have lots of extra money, and they can use that money to invent new ways to exclude competitors. So for example, Oracle was able to repurpose copyright law and sue Google for re-implementing an API. This is a very technical thing, but if it turns out that Oracle wins its case, it will effectively end most kinds of interoperability that we implement today. And Google was able to, or Oracle was able to do that because they had hundreds of millions of extra dollars lying around because they don't have to compete. They're able to extract monopoly rents and extract monopoly concessions from their suppliers. And so it becomes clear that if all you do is reform the law to ease the way for interoperability, but don't do something about the monopolies themselves, that the monopolies will find new venues, new ways of repurposing existing laws or getting new laws passed that allow them to exclude their competitors. And so the thing that we need to do is not focus on the law, but on the outcome. That the outcome that we want in a interoperability regime is competition, and that we don't want firms to be able to use the law to block legitimate competitors. And so what we can say to these firms, either through legislation or through some other means I'll get to in a minute, is we can say to them that you may not wield any law against a competitor who is merely doing interoperability. It is only if they're doing something else that is illegal, like stealing your trade secrets or stealing the personal information of your users non-consensually, or breaking into your computer and doing damage to your systems, then you have a legitimate claim. But if all they're doing is interoperability, then that no statute can be used against them. Then they have an absolute defense against it. Now, you could do that in law, right? You could write a very short law that says, notwithstanding copyright, patent, trade secrecy, non-competition, and so on, non-disclosure, and so on, it is never an offense to implement an interoperable product or tool or service in order to effect a repair, make an accessibility adaptation for people with disabilities, allow for interoperability on behalf of a bona fide user, or so on and so on, right? You could make that statute. It would be a very hard statute to pass because there'd be a lot of industrial actors who'd be arrayed against you. I think ultimately it would be great to have it, but in the meantime, we don't have to wait for lawmaking to make that a reality. There are lots of other avenues to conjure that into existence. So there are antitrust and anti-monopoly enforcement actions against all the big tech companies now in various countries around the world: India, the United States, the various individual states, the European Union, Australia, and so on. There are various solicitors general and attorneys general and district attorneys and so on, and regulators have brought cases against them. Now, in many cases, in many instances, those cases will result in a settlement. The companies will say, I don't want to be mired in 15 years of litigation, and so I'm going to offer to just walk away from this and take my licks. You tell me what penalty I have to pay. Well, we can make a condition of those settlements that the companies are not allowed to enforce laws against interoperators. And so that's actually quite an interesting idea, because it reserves that penalty, that interoperability, that lack of access to anti-interoperability law, to firms that have abused it. And firms that haven't abused it, say small firms that are trying to find the most expeditious way to defend themselves against bad actors and who don't have these giant resources, maybe a cooperative of users, maybe a nonprofit, maybe a local authority has built its own town-wide service. They can continue to use these easy to use tools, but only until they become abusive of them. And then the settlement will end up involving being excluded from using those tools themselves. So it's almost like an ASBO for bad abuse of technology law to exclude competitors. There's other ways that we can do it too. We can do it through procurement. So the big tech companies are heavily reliant on selling services to our governments at all levels, national, regional, and local governments. And those governments already put all kinds of requirements on the vendors who sell to them. It's not only a good idea for competition, it is just mere prudence and duty of care for a government to impose an interoperability requirement on a vendor that they buy technology from. You know, if your local school district is going to buy 10,000 iPads for all the pupils in its schools, and they don't secure the absolute guarantee from Apple that the app that they bought all of those devices to use with can be side-loaded onto those iPads, even if Apple decides to kick it out of the App Store, they're being wildly irresponsible. Likewise, if your local school district buys Google Classroom licenses for all of its pupils while they're at home and locked down and doesn't secure the right to plug any ed tech platform into Google Classroom, they are being derelict in their duties, because it will impair their teachers' ability to do the best kind of pedagogy they can under those difficult circumstances. And if you have this in procurement, then you force the firms to build the interoperability into themselves, and it becomes much harder for them, first of all, to argue that interoperability is technically unachievable, and second of all, it becomes harder for them to stop interoperators from finding ways around the edges to shoehorn interoperability in. And then the last way that we can do this is with voluntary covenants that come out of things like access to standards bodies. So the World Wide Web Consortium that makes all of our web standards, they already require everyone who makes a standard to agree not to enforce their patents against people who implement the standard. They could also say that you can enforce the other rights that you might get under various kinds of law against people who are only interoperating. Against people who are doing security audits, against people who are making technology accessible to people with disabilities, against people who are engaged in legitimate competition. And firms are really anxious to be in standard setting bodies, because the last thing a firm wants is for their own technology to be completely incompatible with a standard that everyone else adopts. So we're on to the last question here. We have just over 2 minutes, and it comes from Salma. How can private companies in smart cities ensure the privacy of their citizens? Who owns the data? So I'm going to be really quick here because I actually have another meeting I need to get to right after this. I wrote an op-ed for The Guardian for the last edition of Guardian Cities about smart cities. And I said right now the way that cities arrange themselves, smart cities view themselves, is they gather data on all the people. And then the city tries to anticipate what the people want. But you could flip that on its head. The city could sense itself how many empty bus seats there are and where the buses are, how much foot traffic there is on sidewalks or on pavements, what is available for sale and where, information about weather and environment and so on. And it could make that information available in bulk to smart devices that are answerable only to users and not to the city and not to the tech company, so that the user's device ingests all of this data and then takes account of the user's preferences and makes recommendations to them that the city never sees, that the big companies never see. In effect, what you're doing is treating people as sensors rather than as things to be sensed. So thank you all very much for this. I was glad, even though with my technical problems, that I was able to finish with 40 seconds left. I hope we can put up that slide with the URL of Bennett's and my paper, Privacy Without Monopoly. And I hope you'll give it a read. I think it's the most significant work on the subject to have been done so far. And I know that sounds immodest, but I think it's really true.